In this chapter, we take up the cost of production. Cost of production in economics is a little bit different than in accounting, and in fact, one of the first things we're going to discuss in this chapter is the difference between implicit and explicit costs, or really the difference between accounting cost and economic cost. Once we're through that, we will then discuss the costs in the short run, and then in the long run too. But in the short run, there are two major costs, variable cost and fixed cost. And we will discuss those, and more importantly, we'll discuss something called marginal costs. So what are economic costs? Well, they're all costs, really. But if you look at the world, we kind of break these down into explicit costs and implicit costs. So the explicit costs are costs that are paid for, i.e. those you write the check for. These are generally considered accounting costs. And when accountants look at this is what they're going to consider. The stuff you write the checks for. Do we have a record of it? Is there some proof that we have paid this? But there's a whole other set of costs that are just as important, and these are considered implicit costs. These are opportunity costs that are not directly paid, but are in fact not paid out in dollars and cents, but in opportunities. Those that you do not pay directly, but they are considered very real costs. For instance, if you're using your time and not getting paid for it, well, that's a very real cost. You could have been doing something else with that time. So the economic cost, as we discuss it, is the sum of the explicit cost and the implicit cost. This also leads us to a difference between accounting profit and what we consider a normal profit. Now, if you look back, you would see we had the explicit and implicit cost. Economists are going to take into account both costs, accountants aren't. So accounting profit is going to differ from what we might call economic profit. So accounting profit is total revenue minus explicit costs. Some profit is essential to keeping the firm in business. So no company can operate without accounting profit. So the point being that, we consider this more than just a surplus. Marx has often argued that a profit is a surplus, and he's been wrong on almost everything he said, so this is another one he's wrong on, because it's very important to the company or the individual running the business. In the case of the sole proprietor, the accounting profit is his or her paycheck. So you can't really say, well, you don't need a profit. Well, then that says the sole proprietor who is putting in their time and resources doesn't need a, quote, profit. Because it's not really a profit, it is their pay. In the case of a corporation, the accounting profit pays stockholders for investing in the company. And it kind of really pays them in two ways. It pays them either by direct payment of dividends, or it pays them by keeping the profits, reinvesting them into the company, and making the company worth more, which means in the long run their stock values will be greater. So that's the reason that stockholders invest in companies, is they want some return on their money, and that a certain level is absolutely essential. So without some level of accounting profit, the firm's not going to survive. This accounting profit that is necessary for survival is called a normal profit. And what we mean by survival is just enough profit to keep them in business, but no more than, if it were less, they would leave the business. If it were more, they would expand the business. So it's just enough to keep them operating at the level they're operating at now. Let's assume I start a business, and assume you've invested money in a business, and you're using a building you own for the business. Well, then accounting profit is equal to the total profit, or total revenue, minus the explicit cost. But if you have implicit costs of the rental value of the building, the interest you could have received on the money you invested, and the value of your time. So you really have three things there that aren't getting counted as cost. The value of the building, you could have rented to somebody else, had an income. The interest you could have received on the money you're using, well, you're using that in the business. And the value of your time, you could have been working someplace else for a certain amount of money. So let's assume revenue equals $100,000 and explicit costs such as costs of goods sold, labor, and utilities are $60,000. This leaves an accounting profit of $40,000. The economic profit will be the accounting profit minus the opportunity costs we mentioned. So assume that we have an economic profit of $40,000, as just stated, and that we have foregone rent of the building of $5,000. All right, that's a cost. Then we have foregone interest. We have put enough money into this that it's costing us $6,000 in foregone interest. And then finally, $29,000 in foregone income. If you look at this, what I've done here is give you an economic profit of zero. Thus, this zero means it could be negative, but if any of those numbers change, let's say your foregone income, because you would have received greater income because you had more education or you're more talented or something, was $60,000, this number will become negative. On the other hand, if your chances of getting much income from a job you haven't worked on a long time, maybe it's worth $10,000, then this becomes positive. It could be negative or positive depending on the implicit cost. In this case, the owner is just covering the implicit cost, and this is enough to keep the owner in business. If the economic profit is negative, it will not be enough to keep him in business. Thus, in this case, the owner is receiving a normal profit. We treat a normal profit as a cost in economics. Let's talk about the short run and the long run. Well, we recognize two time periods in economics, the short run and the long run. They're not explicit periods of time, but based on how quickly a business can change their inputs. The short run is defined as a period of time when some inputs are fixed. That can be one. Usually the fixed input is the size of a plant, although that's not necessarily true, but that's usually the example we use. The long run is a period of time long enough for the business to change all of the inputs. And this is going to vary depending on the business. For instance, how long is the long run? Well, if you're a utility company, it can take you years with permitting and building and construction to build a new power plant. So the long run could run into 5, 10, 15 years. On the other hand, let's take an extremely simple business. You walk dogs. Let's see, what do I need for a dog walking service? Oh, leashes. So I get more customers. All I got to do is run down to the hardware store, buy a few more leashes, and my long run isn't that long. So I can expand my business pretty quickly. Now you might say, what about labor? Well, yeah, at some point I may have to hire more people. Generally, we consider this a pretty easy resource to expand. So whichever one of those will take the most time is going to really dictate your long run. What about production measures in the short run? Well, the job of the business is to produce a product or service. Assume we're in the short run, the only input we can change is labor. We have three important measures of labor productivity. First is just total product. This is simply how many total units we are producing. Second is average product. This is simply total product divided by units of labor. And third is marginal product. And this is the change in total product divided by the change in labor input. Or another way to define it is the output we get from hiring one more worker. So here we have an example of these productivity measures. So for instance, I have labor units 1 through 7, and I have total product 6 through 42. Then I've calculated average product, marginal product also. So with 1 unit of labor, I produce 6 units of output, and I'm assuming with 0, I produce 0. With 2, I'll produce 14. With 3, I'll produce 24. With 4, I'll produce 32. 5, I'll produce 38. 6, I'll produce 42. And 7, I'll produce 42. So my average product is simply, in the first case, 6 divided by 1. In the second one is 14 divided by 2, then 24 divided by 3, and then 32 divided by 4, etc. So we get average product 6, 7, 8, 8, 7.6, 7, and 6. Now notice what's happened here. The average product is rising and then begins to fall. Okay, we'll discuss that in a minute. On the other one, though, you'll notice that it's called marginal product. Marginal product is the product we get from hiring one more unit of labor. So again, 0 input means 0 output. That first worker gives us 6 units of output. Hire a second one. Well, that goes from 6 to 14, so our marginal product is 8. The third one, 24 from 14 to 10, that's 10. The fourth one is 8, 32 minus 24. The next one is 6, 38 minus 32, etc. You'll notice that marginal product peaks at the third unit. And that point at which it peaks is called the point of diminishing returns. And this is based on what we call the law of diminishing returns. A graphical representation of average and marginal product is shown here. I apologize for my freehand drawings. It's the best I can do. Not very good at it. But you can see this. Number one, marginal product goes to 0 while average product is still positive. But the major thing to see here is that the marginal product, actually intersects the average product at the maximum point on the average product curve. In fact, what is really going on here is the marginal product is literally pulling the average up when it's above it and pulling it down when it's below it. What this all comes down to is the law of diminishing returns, which I just mentioned. And this is stated as we add more units of a variable input to a fixed input, at some point the marginal product begins to decline. And we saw that. The marginal product hit 10 and then it started to decline. That's a short run concept because it's assuming we have fixed inputs. In the long run, the law of diminishing returns does not apply. But it does apply in a wide variety of situations in the short run. For instance, in a given period of time, let's say you decide to increase your advertising. What's going to happen? Well, sales may rise. But at some point, you'll keep adding to that advertising time. And once you add to it, you'll find at some point it isn't getting you as many new sales as it was before. So the early stuff is really giving you pretty good marginal returns. Later ads, not adding much to it after that. What about the cost of production in the short run? Well, in the short run, some inputs are fixed and some are variable. So we have 3 different costs to measure. The fixed cost is the cost of the fixed input. For instance, assume you have a building. The lease on the building is $1,000 per month. This is a fixed cost. And let's say you have a 5-year lease. You can't get out of this for 5 years, or if you do, you're going to have to find somebody to sublet it and pay you that. Variable cost is the cost of the inputs you can change. In most examples, we'll consider labor the variable input. It's one that most companies can change fairly quickly, although there are cases where that's not true. We really won't get into them because that kind of complicates things at the moment. Total cost is the sum of the fixed cost and the variable cost. So I've noted these. Total cost is TC, fixed cost TFC, variable cost TVC, and we'll shorten it that way. From the total cost, we can obtain the average and the marginal measures of cost. Average fixed cost, AFC, is the total fixed cost divided by the units of output. Average variable cost, AVC, is total variable cost divided by units of output. Average total cost is TC divided by the units of output, or AFC plus AVC. In other words, I can either just add the 2 averages together, or I can take the total cost divided by the number of units. Marginal cost is a change in total cost divided by change in output, which is also the change in total variable cost divided by the change in output. So here we see the average and the marginal measures and their relationship. In this slide, we see the cost curves. I didn't reproduce the tables because I would suggest on page 18 of your book you do that just to prove this point to you. So we can see the relationship below, and again, excuse my bad freehand. Notice the average fixed cost declines continuously. Doesn't ever reach 0, but comes awfully close. It's said to become asymptotic to the horizontal axis. The marginal cost is U-shaped, as the other two are. but it is U-shaped, and then it gets, it's kind of flat, rounded, and then pretty soon it starts up fairly rapidly. Okay? When it is below the average variable cost is declining, and I think we discussed that earlier. It will then intersect the average variable cost at the minimum point, and then it will rise, and it is literally going to pull up the average variable cost. That's also true of the average total cost, but one of the benefits the average total cost has is it may still be coming down because of the decline in average fixed cost. But again, the marginal cost intersects average variable cost and average total cost at their minimum points. In the above slide, we can see the general shape of each cost curve, and again, the AFC curve slopes downward continuously. This is because we're dividing a fixed number by a larger number all the time. It will get closer to the horizontal axis, but never touch it. The AVC is U-shaped. It falls and then begins to rise. The ATC, average total cost curve, is also U-shaped and lies above the average variable cost. It gets closer to the average variable cost all the time because the difference is the average fixed cost. Of course, the average fixed cost is getting smaller, so it's getting closer. Again, they will never intersect. Finally, the marginal cost curve is U-shaped and it intersects the average variable cost and average total cost curves at their lowest point. The marginal cost curve is literally pulling the average variable cost and average total cost curve down when it is below them and pulling it up when it is above them. What are the relationships of cost to productivity? Well, how do the cost curves relate to the productivity measures we previously discussed? Well, the cost curves are basically inverse of the productivity curves. When marginal product is rising, marginal cost is falling. When marginal product is falling, marginal cost is rising. When average product is rising, average cost is falling. When average product is falling, average cost is rising. What about shifts in the cost curve? Well, over time, the cost curves may shift. If costs go down, the cost curves will shift down. As they go up, the cost curves will shift up. Costs may change if the cost of resources change. So if labor gets more expensive, materials get more expensive, it's going to shift the average and probably the marginal up too. New technologies may lower the costs and shift those cost curves down. If worker productivity changes, the cost curves will shift, generally bringing it down. So if it increases, meaning worker productivity, the curves are going to shift down. If the opposite happens, and it's going to shift up. What about in the long run? Well, in the long run, all costs are variable. The firm can build any plant size they want. The long-run cost curve in your book is what is known as an envelope of short-run cost curves. The short-run average cost curves are tangent to the long-run average cost curve at some point. As the sales of the firm grow, they may find it advantageous to build a larger facility, and this larger facility may have lower costs than the one smaller facility. There are what we call economies and diseconomies of scale. In the region where the long-run cost curve is sloping downward, this indicates the firm can lower costs by building a larger facility. This is called economies of scale. So again, as that long-run cost curve slopes downward, we're seeing economies of scale. Where the long-run cost curve rises, this indicates the firm would raise costs by building a larger facility. This is called diseconomies of scale. If the long-run cost curve is flat, which I don't think your book shows you, it's called a constant return to scale. In other words, no matter what size plant I build, it's going to give me the same cost structure. Would a firm ever build a facility that would cause her costs to rise? Probably not. In most cases, the long-run cost curve flattens out and we get constant returns to scale as the plant gets larger. We tend to find this, and so we tend to use the term minimum efficient scale. And minimum efficient scale is pretty much the point at which the company gets large enough that they can have their costs down to a low enough point where they can compete with just about any firm in the industry. Some years ago, we deregulated the trucking industry, and the argument of the trucking industry against being deregulated was all the big firms would take over the industry and push out all the small firms. Economists did some studies, and what they found was minimum efficient scale for a trucking firm was 3 trucks. Kind of blew that argument out of the water. In other words, It can handle a lot of small companies and large companies both. If you had 3 trucks or more, you were in pretty good shape and could probably compete. And there may be competition in other areas too. In other words, it's not just all the number of trucks. How we operate, how we manage. For instance, one of the things that's happened to companies like Sears is that they've driven their costs up and they're very slow to respond. So, it's often argued that they actually ran into diseconomies of scale because of their highly structured management structure.